Hello everyone, and welcome again to ChessLecture.com. My name is Dana Mackenzie. Today I'd like to talk with you about a tactical motif that I've never actually seen mentioned in a book, and I call it reversing the move order. I wish I could show you the game that first made me aware of this idea. It was a game played by Kasparov sometime in the 1980s, and it appeared in Robert Burns' New York Times chess column. I heard that Kasparov played two moves in a row that would have been completely ordinary moves, except for the fact that he played them in the opposite order from what you would normally expect. And that reversal of the move order turned it into a brilliant combination. I thought at the time, wow, that's a really cool trick. Unfortunately, since then I've lost the newspaper clipping, and when I was getting ready for this lecture, I was not able to figure out which Kasparov game that was. And actually, I'd appreciate anyone who could figure that out for me. Nevertheless, the lesson stuck with me, even if the game didn't. So today I'm going to do the next best thing and show you some of my games where this tactical motif occurred, or should have occurred. The fact is, it's harder to remember this idea than you'd think. Most of the time in my games, an opportunity comes along to reverse the normal move order, and I just overlook it, and I don't realize until later when I go over the game, either by myself or with a computer, that I've missed this opportunity. So I'm personally still struggling with this concept. But as Jesse Cry says, one way to improve in chess is to identify things that you're repeatedly doing wrong and try to understand why. So in this lecture, I'll also try to talk a little bit about why I'm missing these ideas of reversing the move order. And maybe some of you will find that you're missing this idea also in some of your games. And if you look for it, maybe you'll be able to spot it. Okay, so I'm going to go over three examples from recent games of mine. The first is a game that took place earlier this year. My opponent was named Elon Benjamin. He's an expert who lives in the same town that I do, and so we end up playing each other quite a bit. And we usually have very good games, and this game was no exception. So I'm going to skip ahead to the position where reversing the move order could have made a big difference to me. So this is the position we got to after Black's 24th move. So it's now White to move. I'm White. Elon Benjamin is Black. Let's first of all talk about the position in general. First of all, one thing you might notice is Black is a pawn up. Okay, so this opening was a king's gambit, and I have not yet recovered my gambit pawn, but White does have a great deal of compensation for the pawn. In particular, a second thing you should notice is that Black's queen side is still not fully developed. The queen knight hasn't come out, and the queen rook hasn't come out. And in fact, it's very hard for Black to bring out the queen knight right now because all of its development squares are blocked. And as long as the knight can't move, the rook is also cut off from playing any meaningful role in the game. So that's a very important thing to notice. And third, the other important thing to notice is that White has a mate in two threat. If you imagine letting White play two moves in a row without giving Black a move in between, then White could checkmate with either knight to d4 followed by rook to e8 check, or with knight to f4 followed by knight to g6 check. So the question then arises of whether there is some way to cash in on this mate threat, even though, of course, Black is allowed to make a move to defend. And I find that this technique is often a useful way to find a combination. Imagine what you would do if you were given two moves in a row, and then that gives you an idea of how you should proceed, even if your opponent does play a move in between. Now, so in this position, I'm sure I must have, at least subconsciously, looked at knight to d4 and knight to f4. But I ruled them out pretty quickly because I saw that either one of those moves, for example, knight to d4, could be answered by pawn takes knight on g5. And then the mating threat no longer works because the bishop on f7 is hanging. And so without giving it any more thought than that, I started looking for ways to improve the position so that the mate threat would be harder to defend. And I came up with the move bishop to g6, which I thought was a great move. I was really excited at the time, but it turns out it was the wrong move. My thinking was that now, after black plays pawn takes knight, white will play knight to d4, and the checkmate on e8 is virtually unstoppable. Unfortunately, there was one hole in my thinking, which was that I forgot that when you offer sacrifice, your opponent does not have to take it. And in fact, black has much better moves here than pawn takes knight. My opponent played bishop takes knight on e2. And the point here is now, after I played rook takes e2, he's now cleared the a6 square for his knight to come out. And now I have no checkmate on e8. And so now white's attack is no longer quite as dangerous. And the game ended up in a draw. I'll show you a few more moves just so you'll see what happened. I played knight to e4. He played bishop d4. I played g4. He played knight to c5. The weakness of the a pawn forces me to trade knights. And now we have a bishops of opposite colors position. I played rook to e7, but basically there's no hope of winning this position anymore, because white does not have enough material on the board to checkmate black's king. And after bishop takes pawn and rook takes pawn, we get to a bishops of opposite color endgame where I don't have any real advantage, and it ended up being a draw after a few more moves. So let's go back to the original position and see what I missed. So remember that the theme of this lecture is reversing the move order. So what I should have done before I played, I played bishop to g6 with the idea of playing knight to d4 next. And what I should have done, just on general principle, was ask myself if there's any point in playing them in the opposite order. So instead of bishop g6 first, what happens if I play knight to d4 first? Well, as I said, what probably kept me from playing this move was the black would play pawn takes knight. But I could then follow up with bishop to g6. And now we've gotten to exactly the position that I wanted to get to in the other line. So the point of moving the knight first, at least one point, was that black was not given any other alternatives. After knight to d4, the mate threat is too powerful, so black had to defend the mate threat right away. He didn't have time to do anything else. And so he's forced into playing pawn takes knight.